Hi everybody, welcome back to another episode of your literature class. My name is Percy and this is the second part of our discussion on postcolonialism in literature. Now, if you haven't seen the first video, I want you to go back to the recording of the first video. The link is down below. Okay, so you may access the link below at the description box. And right now, we're gonna continue our lecture on postcolonialism and literature. So last episode, we talked about postcolonial literatures and its nature and classifications. And we also talk about postcolonial literatures and its relationship with what we call English studies, or the study of English in terms of translation, in terms of language production, and also in terms of the writings in literature and the kind of ideology that the English language are actually espousing in terms of its post-colonial perspective. So we talked about that. Again, if you haven't seen the first video, it's in the description box. The link is there, so kindly access it for us to have context on what we're going to talk about today. We closed the last lecture by quoting this: those in the periphery immerse themselves in the imported culture, denying their origins in an attempt to become more English than the English. And this talks about, just like what we said last in the previous episode, this talks about the desire, consciously or probably unconsciously, of the colonized country, their people, to become more colonial in terms of their perspectives and mindset than the colonizing power or the country who colonized them. And there's a specific term that we need to first understand for us to be able to go deeper to the discussion of post-colonialism, and that term is hegemony, okay, or hegemony. What is this all about? Hegemony is the weight of the empire, or when you say empire, the colonizing power, even if it's not there anymore, continues to dominate cultural production in much of the post-colonial world. So when we say hegemony, what we're saying is that the presence of the colonizers might not be there anymore at present, but their influences, their ideology, their kind of culture that was imposed consciously or unconsciously to the colonized country or the colonized place is still actually there in terms of cultural production, in terms of language, in terms of philosophy, and of course, other aspects such as literature and the arts and humanities in general. So that's what we call hegemony in post-colonialism. So again, it means the influences of the colonizing power or the empire. It means the presence that is not literal, but the presence in the guise of ideology, in the guise of culture, influences, and even mindsets, even perspectives. The things that, for example, in the Philippines, the things that is not originally ours in terms of culture, but we embraced. Okay, so we have common examples like our standard of, let's say, beauty, or we embrace it. Maybe unconsciously along the way, we embrace the kind of standard that is Western. Okay, not just in terms of beauty, which is a common example, but even in terms of language. We know that the more English you are in terms of your language, the more you speak English, the more you are branded as educated, you are branded as intellectual. It's as if you cannot speak the language of the colonizers, you amount to nothing, or you are subordinate or lower than those who are fluent in the use of language, okay, which makes me more critical right now because I'm speaking English. Okay, so again, we know that for the purposes of communication, we speak the language because, just like what they said, it's a global means of communication. But again, as English majors, as literature students, we should also be critical about this. We should also be critical about the kind of ideology attached to the communication and the language that we are using. Okay, so that's part of the bigger picture of what hegemony is all about. Okay, it means that, again, the influences are there. It is felt, it is manifesting, and it is part of our everyday lives, our worship, quote unquote, of foreigners, of white people, our sudden adjustments towards, treating a foreigner, a white person, better than treating our fellow Filipinos. So the cultural hegemony have been maintained through canonical assumptions about literature. Now, the role of literature in terms of cultural production and post-colonialism is its ability to propagate, its ability to continue the canon of Western or the imperial ideology. So just like what we said a while ago, we know that the canon of world literature, let's say, is littered with white writers, with white people, with literary pieces from England, from America, from Europe, and this became the standard. That's why, for example, when you compare, let's say, a Shakespeare to that of an NVM Gonzalez, okay, which is a Filipino literary figure, we know that there is that subconscious, I don't know if I'm saying the right term, no, but there's that internal mechanism in us that would automatically adhere to Shakespeare as a better kind, as a better example compared to NVM Gonzalez. But we have to be critical about it. We have to question our standard when it comes to literature and philosophy as well. Now, going back, there is this case of the uncivilized nation in most of the scholarly writings on post-colonialism. When we say the case of civilized nation and uncivilized nation, there's that automatic branding or categorization of nations and regions. So when we say first world countries, or probably let's say the Western countries, there's always the attachment of the idea of dominant, of creators, and discoverers, right? So when you, for example, read a certain piece of history that says this white guy discovered this land, okay, so this white navigator or traveler or this group of white people from the 1500s and 1600s discovered this archipelago. So it's as if they are the ones discovering something that is not civilized, that is not known back then. But even before or prior to them coming to that land, we all know that there is already a civilization, there is already a people group, a culture, an established society. But they would be branded less than the one who discovered them. That is the case of the civilized nation. Then when we talk about the East, we know that it would always have the attachment of the ideas as inferior, as created instead of creating, or creator as discovered. So in that equation, you know that the discoverer is the West, the discovered is the East. And that became an equation to how people look at the eastern side of the globe compared to the western hemisphere, because the western people, the western ideology, the empire would always be the bigger one, would always be the powerful one, would always be the educated one. So there's also the branding of the East being mystical, being barbaric, or being uncivilized. Sadly, when you say East, the Eastern region, like Asia, Southeast Asia, or let's say India or China or Japan, they would brand, the West would brand these regions and these countries as mystical, as something that is exotic, something that is uncivilized, something that is way beyond the kind of lifestyle that they have. That's why they felt like going to the East and educating them in terms of the kind of culture and practices they have is a good thing. It's as if they are extending help by imposing the standard of the West, by imposing the kind of religion and education and philosophy that they espouse, thinking that if Indian people stop their cultural practices and embrace the Western standard, then they will become more civilized. But the question there is, why are they the ones imposing and thinking that the Eastern practice is uncivilized? That's the kind of mindset that colonizers have. And sadly, unfortunately, even today, even without their literal presence, their presence in terms of ideology and standards are still there, being felt by the colonized. Hence, that's what we call hegemony. Their influences are intricately weaved in our consciousness. It's as if it's impossible for us to live life apart from the standards that was imposed to us. So the case of uncivilized and civilized nation. So there's always that category of social alienation. When you put that in equation as a structure, we know that there is the master versus slave, there is the free versus the bound, there is the ruler versus the ruled, and the white versus colored. Okay, that's the kind of equation. But it would always be a challenge because we know that movements such as white supremacy and white ideology would be looked at by other colors as dominating, as superior. And that is actually rooted not just in their skin color, but it is rooted on the hundreds of years of history of slavery and domination and conquering lands and enslaving other people. That's why the hierarchy of white and black would reveal the underprivileged being us colored people, and the privileged one being, you know, the white people. And again, in the 21st century, there are well-meaning writers who are also white, coming from all of these prominent countries, but are opposing these ideologies. And that is a very hopeful case for us in the 21st century. We are happy to, more than happy actually, it's very promising to see a lot of white writers trying to oppose white ideology and oppose the dominance of white supremacy rather, and embracing multiculturalism. That is the direction that we are all hopeful to venture into along the way. And the Philippines is another case in terms of racism, in terms of the other challenges that we have. There are studies that would say that the Philippines is a racist country. It differs only in the degree, but Philippines being a racist country can actually still be rooted on the influences of the white people dominating us, conquering us, colonizing us. Because after colonization, we were not left really free. We were left literally probably in terms of our own government free, but in terms of ideology, we're still struggling. And Filipino people would always want to be better in terms of our color, in terms of our status in life, because these were the hundreds of years of experience that we had from the colonizers. Therefore, in effect, we know that Filipinos want to be, just like what we said, more English than English. We want to kind of prove that our standard is still, in terms of post-colonialism, the kind of standard that was imposed in us or to us, and even better than that. We want to be better. That's why we want to be more English than English. But it's coming from a root of colonialism. And now the post-colonial effects can still be felt. And not just in the Philippines, but in many other countries, many other colonized countries, there's always the branding of the East being uncivilized, uneducated. When, for example, Southeast Asian countries eating insects as part of their cultural practice, which is not a big problem. But Western people would come in and say that's barbaric, that's uncivilized, that's uneducated. Says who? Says who? Says your standard. But their culture of hundreds and even thousands of years would say that's good, that's sacred, that's fine. But here they are trying to come and educate the uncivilized, the uneducated. The question now is, what can we do about it? How do we now respond as colonized, experiencing post-colonialism? The first one is, of course, to decolonize. Decolonization. It is the process in which a country that was previously a colony controlled by another country becomes politically independent. And that is the goal. Decolonization, and of course, it started with the political movement. Decolonization is being conscious about all the colonial influences and trying to change it, trying to eradicate, if you may, all of these influences, all of these hegemonic influences of the Western Empire. That means promoting our native language, our different languages, instead of just subscribing to English. That's why in our university, in the Philippines, in Far Eastern University, we do not have the English-only policy. We only impose that probably in our English subjects for another purpose. But in terms of, in general, we know that English-only policy, if you deconstruct that, is very colonial. It's very post-colonial, right? It means you trying to subconsciously, it is you trying to communicate that other languages do not matter. Other regional languages such as Ilocano and Visaya and Hiligaynon and Chavacano and many other languages, Tagalog, these languages are worthy of being discovered, worthy of being used, worthy of being preserved. So why can't we propagate these languages instead of just subscribing to a better or a higher educated language called English? So this is part of decolonization, among many. Revisiting instructional materials. What about our textbooks? What about the canon of literature and philosophy? What about, let's say, our syllabus, our curriculum? We can always decolonize our curriculum by being critical about the kind of ideology we are imposing or we're teaching our students. And for future teachers, English majors, be careful about the selection of your texts. If you want to decolonize your curriculum, your syllabus, you have to deliberately include the minority, deliberately include those that are not prominent in the eyes of the colonial power. You have to deliberately include examples and writers from the regions, from probably never heard of places in terms of, the dominant culture, and promote it and use it so that there will be an avenue for students to know more about that culture. Because that is our goal, to be able to identify ourselves as independent culture, as a beautiful, unique identity that is not in any way less or subordinate than the Western ideology, than the Western identity. So decolonization is important. Number two, we can always be promoting new historicism. When you say new historicism, this reopened the interpretation of literature to the social, political, and historical milieu that produced it. Literature is not the record of a single mind, but the end product of a particular cultural movement. So when you say a product of a particular cultural movement, what we're saying is that history and literature should be written in the perspective of the culture, not in the perspective of a single ideology or a single writer. That's not literally one writer, but a single ideology when it comes to writing. For the most part, we know back then that our history in the Philippines was written by the Western perspective. That's why we want to use new historicism to rewrite history in the perspective of our very own identity, our very own culture, our very own regions. We need these minorities to be heard. We need them to be represented, not just the perspective of the educated and the West. Okay, so these are some of the things that we can do in new historicism. It leads us to a bigger philosophical movement that we can always espouse and embrace, and we call it multiculturalism or multiculturalism. And when we say multiculturalism, this is not just the welcoming of many cultures and many identities, but this actually points us to the root of the problem, and that is identity politics. Later on, we will talk about what identity politics is in probably a different episode. Now, when we talk about multiculturalism, this seeks the inclusion of the views and contributions of diverse members of society while maintaining respect for their differences and withholding the demand for their assimilation into the dominant culture. We know that when we talk about postcolonialism, there is a dominant culture, there is a dominant identity. And multiculturalism tries to not just change that, but tries to break that pattern by deliberately including minorities and different races, different identities represented in our study, in our text, in our syllabus, in our instructional materials, in our discourse, in our law of the land. Multiculturalism seeks not just the protection, but the advocate of it, the advocate for the minorities, advocating their different practices. The problem of multiculturalism actually is what we call identity politics. And when we say identity politics, this is the politics of recognition, trying to recognize only the kind of people they want to recognize. White people would probably only recognize white people in a very racist setting. But of course, we know that it's changing along the way, and we're happy for that. Identity politics talks about misrecognition or non-recognition of minorities. Instead of, for example, talking about Muslims in our discourse, we deliberately ignore them. And by ignoring them, we think that we are not doing any harm. But what we're actually doing is that we are not including them in the discussion. We're not including them in the discourse. And because of that, a lot of people are not educated about it. And because people are not educated about it, they try to comprehend and understand their practices in terms of the dominant culture, saying that all of these people are branded as terrorists or everything that the white media would project and communicate to the rest of the world. And because we are not aware of their unique, beautiful culture and identity, because we did not include it in the discourse, we thought that anything that the dominant culture talks about in terms of that identity is final. So we believe what media would say. We believe what news out there would say without getting to know our Muslim people. And not just for Muslims, but even for Jewish people, even for minorities, our Lumad in the Philippines, our Aitas, our different tribes that are worthy to be celebrated in terms of their communities. We do not include them. That's why multiculturalism is important, because that is an opportunity for people to break identity politics. Again, identity politics is the recognition politics, or the politics of recognition, trying to recognize the people group that they only want to recognize. It means that I will only recognize the people I understand. If I am in authority, I'm in the government, or I am in power, then I have the ability to only recognize what I want. So I would probably be, I'm a white person, so I would only recognize the same person I am, as I am. I would only recognize people who are also educated, like me. I would only recognize people who are only straight, because I'm straight. And we are neglecting those who are not the same as us, those who are different. I will only probably recognize Christians because I'm a Christian. This is a Christian nation, so definitely there's no place for other religions. That is a problem. That's an identity politics. The Philippines is branded a Christian country. But when you look at that, it actually is a breeding ground for identity politics, because it becomes harder for Filipinos to accept those who are not Christians, or maybe accept them on a certain level only. We still think lower of them. We still think that Muslim people are not as good as Christians. They're going to hell because we do not know their practice. We don't know because we don't talk about it. We don't talk about it because it's not part of the discourse. There is non-recognition. Hence, multiculturalism is important. It is an opportunity to put and lay down everything in our plates and talk about it consciously, deliberately. And lastly, criticism. criticism is important. Critical interpretation and judgment of the representations in literature, which includes language, history, ideology, social and political, philosophical, and cultural underpinnings. That means that as we talk about literature, this would be a gateway for us to be critical. To be critical is not wrong. The problem with being critical is that it has become negative because people, media, people in authority, people in power would say criticism is negative. That's why people are just, accepting everything without criticizing. Because to be critical in a very non-progressive space is considered an attack. It's considered activism, and activism is negative for them. But to be critical is an opportunity to open perspectives. To be critical means that you are not just accepting something because somebody said so. That you are accepting it because you know that this is beneficial for the majority. But if it harms a small group of people, if it harms and actually takes away or eradicate the right or the human right of other, communities, then by all means, we should be critical about it. Okay? The problem with another effect of postcolonialism is actually just to be submissive. To be submissive about the kind of leadership, the kind of ideology being espoused, because to go against it, to be critical about it, is considered negative. Back then, in history, we were prohibited to be critical, or else we will be killed by the colonizers, or else we will go to hell according to the scripture. That's why Filipinos will not question for hundreds of years. We will just obey. And sadly, it is probably still happening at some point. That's why it's important to be critical. That's part of our rights. And that is part of a healthy, educated discourse in postcolonialism. We should resist ideology that is being imposed by the powerful. If it's beneficial, why not? Beneficial, we mean beneficial for everybody, not just beneficial for our own selfish gains. This is not a political discussion, this is a philosophical discussion. So I want us to open our philosophical eyes and be in a position of reflection, being reflexive about our own perspectives as colonized people. We are a product of colonization. And if we are not critical about our roots and the roots of all of these things, then we would continue to be the kind of people we are. Decolonization, multiculturalism, new historicism, and criticism are all important for us to strike a balance and break the effects of hegemony in a post-colonial society like ours. So I hope that you learned something today in our second discussion of postcolonialism in literature. Once again, this is Percy, and thank you for being with me today in our lecture on postcolonialism. I'll see you on the next episodes.